when my parents kicked me out and how I got my life together. I remember the sound the door made when it slammed shut behind me. Not the sound of wood or metal, but the sound of finality. The sound of a chapter of my life slamming itself closed. The night was cold, mist hanging low in the streets, and I stood there on the pavement, a backpack slung over one shoulder, my old phone in my pocket, and nowhere to go. My parents had warned me for months. Get your act together or get out. Live by the rules in this house or find another place to stay. But I had never really believed they'd do it. Not until the moment my father refused to open the door, my mother's silhouette framed by the kitchen window, shaking her head as I knocked harder and harder. Not until that sound, the sound of the deadbolt clicking, finally sank in. Suddenly, I was on the street, 18 years old, and completely lost. I wandered until the sting of the wind felt like tiny needles across my skin. At the bus station, I sank down onto a cold, hard bench. The plastic was chipped, and the air reeked of gasoline and old cigarettes. My fingers shook as I pulled my phone out of my pocket, scrolling desperately through old messages. Not one person came to mind who would take me in tonight. Not one. That first night felt like eternity. I watched buses come and go, watched the city settle down, watched strangers pass by as if I were invisible. The hours blurred together until the neon sign across the street winked out and the sound of traffic dwindled to an occasional hum. I pulled my knees to my chest and buried my head in my arms. The sting of rejection and fear bubbled up until I was shaking. That was the moment I promised myself one thing. I would find a way to make this right. Somehow. The morning came slowly, the gray light making the bus station feel even more desolate. I pulled the zipper of my thin jacket all the way up and trudged towards a kiosk that was just opening its shutters. The owner didn't even look at me as I counted the coins in my palm and bought a stale pretzel and a cup of bitter, watery coffee. The warmth felt like a miracle. The food felt like a tiny mercy. With nowhere to go, I started walking. Street after street, block after block. The only goal was to stay warm and stay moving. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes glancing my way, then quickly looking elsewhere. I felt like a ghost, not belonging, not noticed, not wanted. Around noon, I sank down on a low wall near a park. The air was sharp and clean, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe. That was when I noticed him. An old man, with a scruffy beard and a worn coat, came to sit beside me. He didn't say much at first, just gave a nod and pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes out of his pocket. He offered me one. I shook my head and he shrugged. "Rough night?" he said, exhaling a long stream of smoke. I didn't reply. Not at first. What was there to say? My silence didn't seem to bother him. "Been there myself," he said quietly. "More times than I can count. You're not the first kid to land on this bench, and you won't be the last. The trick is not to stay too long." I finally glanced over at him. His eyes weren't judgmental. They weren't cold or mocking. They were tired, yes, but warm somehow. "Where do you go from here?" he asked. That was the first time in 24 hours that someone spoke to me like a person, not like a shadow. And for reasons I still don't understand, I started talking. I started telling him about my parents, about the fights, about the slammed door. I started telling him about the nights I felt like I had nowhere to belong, and the mornings I felt like I had no reason to get out of bed. He listened, just listened. And when I was done, he didn't say, "That's too bad," or "That's life." He said, "All right, kid, let's figure out your next step." I didn't expect much when the old man spoke those words. "Let's figure out your next step." They sounded too hopeful, too generous, but for some reason, maybe desperation, maybe sheer exhaustion, I found myself nodding. He introduced himself as Ray. Not Mr. Ray or anything formal, just Ray. He was in his late 50s, a veteran of hard times. A man who spoke openly about the nights he'd spent under bridges and the mornings he'd spent scrounging for a hot cup of coffee. Yet, despite the lines on his face and the weight in his voice, he possessed a quiet resilience. "Rule number 1, he said, brushing the ashes from the tip of his cigarette. You can't wait for things to happen. You've got to make 'em happen." That morning, Ray walked with me down to a local soup kitchen. He introduced me to the volunteers, helped me get a hot meal. He spoke openly with the staff about available shelters, and he gave me a piece of paper with an address and a phone number. "This place takes in young people like you. They can help you find a bed, a job lead, something to build on." At first, I felt ashamed accepting help, but when you're down to your last breath of pride, you realize it's worth swallowing for the chance at a new life. I followed Ray's instructions. The shelter gave me a bed for a few nights. The staff introduced me to a job counselor. Suddenly, a door that felt bolted shut started to crack open. A week later, I landed a part-time job washing dishes at a crowded diner. The work was grueling. 10-hour shifts standing over a sink, hands raw and pruny from scalding water, a boss who yelled more than he spoke. But every dollar I earned felt like a piece of myself being rebuilt. I saved every cent. I stopped eating in the diner, except when offered a free shift meal. I kept going back to the shelter every night, and every morning I pulled myself out of that bed with one thought repeating in my head: today, I am one step closer to making it. Days turned into weeks. The routine became a lifeline. 5 a.m., wake up, wash in the tiny bathroom, read a book I found at the shelter. 7 a.m., 5 p.m., dishwasher shift at the diner. 5 p.m., 7 p.m., job searches at the public library. 7 p.m., 10 p.m., helping out at the shelter in exchange for a bed. 10 p.m., collapse, exhausted but hopeful. Through that routine, I started finding myself again, not in the sense of some grand epiphany, but in countless tiny victories. More than anything, it was the feeling of belonging to a process, a path forward. The nights when despair came whispering, I would remember Ray's words. Rule number 1, you can't wait for things to happen. You've got to make them happen. I repeated it like a mantra until it became part of my marrow. With every dollar saved, every shift worked, every lesson learned, I was crafting a new identity. Not the rebellious kid thrown out of the house, but a young man determined to stand tall. 6 months. That's how long it took for the boy thrown out of his house to evolve into a young man with a tiny room, a routine, and a growing sense of belonging. The tiny room I was renting wasn't much: a bed, a desk, and a closet that refused to close properly. But to me, it felt like a castle. I kept working at the diner, kept putting every dollar I could into a bank account that grew slowly but steadily. And then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon, as I was clearing tables, the owner pulled me aside. "You work harder than most I've ever had here," she said. "Ever thought about doing more than dishes?" It was an unexpected offer. A chance to work the register, to learn basic bookkeeping, and to start training as an assistant manager. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The first weeks were challenging. New skills, new responsibilities, new ways to prove myself. But every shift taught me something valuable. How to balance a till, how to lead a team, how to listen to customers. The owner noticed, and soon the hourly wage bumped up. The tiny room felt a little more like a home. The savings started adding up. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud of myself. Then came the phone call. My sister, voice shaking, told me that our mom had been asking about me, not in anger, not in judgment, but in quiet concern. Months ago, The thought of reaching out would have felt like swallowing broken glass. But now I felt like I had something to show for myself. I called. We spoke. The conversation was awkward and slow, but it felt like planting a seed. "I didn't know how to help you," she said quietly. "I didn't understand what you were going through." "I didn't either," I replied. It wasn't about forgiveness right then, or fixing everything. It was about making space for something new to grow. With a stable job and a tiny room, a fresh bank account, and a faintly mended bridge with my family, I started dreaming for the first time in years. Not just about surviving until tomorrow, but about going further. Getting a certification, applying for a better position, maybe even going back to school one day. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about Ray. I hadn't seen him for months. The last I'd heard, he had moved to another part of the city. But the lessons he gave me felt closer than ever. Rule number 1. You can't wait for things to happen. You've got to make them happen. A year passed, and I was no longer the boy on the bus stop. The boy thrown out with a backpack and nowhere to go had evolved into a young man with a purpose, a routine, and a quiet confidence. Through long shifts and countless moments of doubt, I discovered something I had never fully understood before. You don't change when things are easy. You change when you have no choice but to rise. By the end of that year, I had saved enough to move from that tiny room into a modest studio. The walls weren't much to look at, and the floorboards creaked under every step, but it was mine. The feeling of unlocking my own door every evening was like a victory song. Through connections I'd made at the diner, I landed an entry-level job in an office supply company. Suddenly I had a desk, a computer, and a boss who gave constructive feedback instead of yelling across a kitchen. The pay was better, the hours more regular, and every dollar saved felt like planting a seed for a future I was slowly starting to envision. With some stability came space to think, to remember passions I had buried when survival was all I had room for. I started going to evening classes, brushing up on math, and reading about business. I started going for jogs in the morning, cooking simple meals in the evening, and making friends who inspired me to reach higher. More than anything, I learned to listen. To others, to myself. Slowly, the conversation with my family grew warmer. We met for lunch one Sunday. Awkward at first, then comfortable. Not because we ignored the past, but because we acknowledged it. "I was scared for you," my father confessed. "We thought tough love was the only way." "I felt abandoned," I replied, voice shaking. "But I understand now. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself." That conversation felt like another door opening. A few years later, when I felt truly settled, I started volunteering at the same shelter that had taken me in. Helping young people understand that the night doesn't last forever felt like closing a circle. I shared my story with those lost, frightened kids huddled in the corners of the common room. Not because I had all the answers, but because I knew that sometimes all you need is one person to say, "I've been where you are, and you can make it out. You can stand tall again." Today, looking back, I don't see tragedy anymore. I see a chapter that shaped every line of who I am. Being thrown out of that house was never about cruelty. It was about resilience, about the moment I learned that the path to belonging, to purpose, to belonging to myself, began when I refused to give up. Rule number 1 still guides me every morning. You can't wait for things to happen. You've got to make them happen.